Hi, kids. Today is our second set of FBI notes for the World War One chapter. This article is called "The War to End All Wars." We've seen that phrase before. Obviously, World War One was not the war to end all wars. So I'm using the phrase ironically here. We're going to see the United States get involved in the war. Also, we're going to see how the war came to an end with really nobody satisfied with the way that it came that it came to an end. All it did really was plant the seeds for another war that would be even much more devastating than what this one was, and that was World War II. So, if you could follow along while I read. Okay, World War One, the war to end all wars. Supporting the war effort. In April 1917, the United States joined the World War I on the Allied side. Following the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 and the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, American public opinion shifted toward Britain and France and against Germany. Finally, in the spring, the USA declared war. Raising, training, and transporting an army was not an easy task. In order to raise troops, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. This law put a military draft into effect, requiring all young men between the ages of 21 and 30 register for military service. Eventually, almost 4 million Americans served in the military in World War I. The draft was not popular with all Americans, and the military contained many of the same flaws of American civilian society. For example, thousands of African American men served in World War I, but they were forced to serve in segregated units. The U.S. Army did not desegregate for another 30 years. 1 in every 5 recruits was born in a foreign land, such as Italy, Mexico, or the Philippines, and routinely faced discrimination in their experience. However, military service did have benefits too. Many illiterate Americans were supplied education that they would have otherwise not received and learned to read, a skill that would benefit them after the war as well as within it. At home, Americans learned to conserve resources such as food that now needed to go to the war effort. To replace the vegetables that suddenly became difficult to obtain, Americans began planting victory gardens in whatever soil they could find. Paying for the war effort was also a daunting task. To finance the cost of the war, the government sold Liberty bonds to the American public. People would pay the government, say $15 for a Liberty bond, with the promise that the government would pay them back $20 10 years later. Many Americans began developing savings in this way when the bonds were eventually paid off. However, not all Americans were in favor of the war. Many opposed it on religious or political grounds. Many thought the draft was unconstitutional and refused to serve. Unfortunately, many Americans equated dissent with disloyalty and urged the government to pass laws that criminalized protest. Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which put many Americans in prison simply for criticizing the government. Americans at war. Even before the USA went to war, America supplied the Allies with millions of tons of supplies. Virtually all of these items were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, and the ships that carried them were in danger from German submarines. To protect the unarmed cargo ships, Allied leaders developed the convoy system. This positioned the cargo ships within a ring of armed battleships and cruisers. The convoys usually got through and delivered their goods to the struggling Allies. When the American Expeditionary Force finally did start arriving in the summer of 1917, it was placed under the command of General John J. Pershing, who insisted that the Americans fight together instead of being split up and sent wherever the French and British thought they should go. The Americans were needed badly after Russia had a revolution in 1917, and their new leader, Lenin, pulled Russia out of the war. Also, before the Americans arrived, the Germans launched their peace offensive in March 1918. It was an all-out attack designed to end the war on the Western Front once and for all. Fighting raged on the Western Front throughout the spring and summer of 1918. All of the armies were becoming exhausted. The only fresh fighting force in Europe were the American doughboys who started arriving in large numbers in the summer. Finally, in July 1918, the Americans went into battle alongside the French near the French town of Chateau Thierry, the first action American soldiers saw. After weeks of hard fighting, the Americans pushed the Germans out of Belleau Wood and blunted the peace offensive. Then, more than 1 million Americans attacked the Germans in the Battle of the Argonne Forest. Even though the Germans were still in France and had the Allies on the verge of defeat only a few weeks earlier, they were now themselves exhausted and barely able to hold their army together. The German homeland was on the verge of starvation because the British Navy blockaded Germany, not letting any supplies in or out by sea. By November 1918, Germany was almost in a state of revolution, and they decided to end the war. The U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, knowing that the war was close to an end, released his plan of what the world should look like after the war was over. It was called the 14 Points and pledged to treat all nations fairly. After having seen the 14 points on November 11, 1918, the Germans accepted the armistice, which was an agreement to stop fighting. All sides agreed to talk out their problems at the negotiating table. It was tragic that it took millions of deaths to make the governments agree to something they could have easily done back in 1914. Shaping the peace. When the armistice went into effect, the war was basically over. The two sides could have started the war back up, but neither had any real desire to do so. However, the war would not be officially over until a peace treaty was actually negotiated and signed. Woodrow Wilson, despite the USA being in the war for only a year or so, wanted to take a lead role in the negotiations. He wanted the 14 points to be the guiding force shaping the post-war world. Instead of countries vying for empires, he wanted to see territorial issues solved based on the principle of self-determination. The people can rule themselves instead of being part of someone else's empire. Wilson also wanted to see an international organization called the League of Nations founded, where countries could talk out their disagreements before resorting to war. When the leading countries met in Paris to discuss the Permanent Peace Treaty in 1919, the conference was dominated by the Big Four. President Woodrow Wilson represented the USA. Prime Minister David Lloyd George represented Britain. Foreign Minister Georges Clemenceau represented France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando represented Italy. The other members of the Big Four had no real intention of following Wilson's plan for the peace treaty. They all figured they had suffered much more at the hands of the Germans than the Americans had, and they all had empires to protect too. Much of Wilson's dreams never made it into the peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles, as it came to be known, dealt severely with Germany. In it, the following demands were made of Germany. Germany lost huge areas of territory, including land that had been ethnically German for hundreds of years. Germany lost all their colonies. Germany had to take full responsibility for the war. Because they had to take full responsibility for the war, Germany also had to pay huge reparations to pay for the damages from the war. Finally, severe limits were placed on the size of the German military. And there you see a map of the what Europe looked like after the war was over. In addition, many territorial changes were made to Eastern Europe, which Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia once controlled. The nations of Austria-Hungary and Czechoslovakia were created from the now destroyed Austria-Hungary Empire. Serbia unified with other Balkan peoples to form the new nation of Yugoslavia, just as the assassins of Archduke Ferdinand had hoped. A new nation of Poland was created from former German and Russian land. The new Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland were created from Russian territory. Wilson did get one thing he wanted. The League of Nations became a reality. However, when Wilson returned home, he discovered the American public was in no mood to engage with foreign countries after having been pulled into the war. So while the League of Nations existed, the USA never became a member. Because the strongest nation in the new post-war world did not take part, the League was ineffective in preventing another world war just 20 years later. So we see the United States getting into the war. We see kind of an ugly repeating habit in American history of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, where we talk a lot about freedom of speech in this country, and then as soon as we have a time when it's important to have freedom of speech, people get angry and pass laws saying that you can't criticize the government. It happened in World War I. We see the end of the war, as well as kind of how the whole thing really didn't make anybody happy. You had people settling grudges and new territories being created, but at the same time, the self-determination that Wilson wanted, that they did put into place in terms of Austria-Hungary, where they created Czechoslovakia and stuff like that. Well, that didn't really apply when it came to British colonies that were other places in the world, Africa and Asia, French colonies. They didn't bother with self-determination for that. So you can see just a lot of things about the war led to a lot of people being just unsatisfied. Okay.